Okay, so my name is Darren Leong. Um, I'm here today to talk about practical security monitoring and incident response in Microsoft Azure. So just a little bit about myself. So I've been in information and cybersecurity for a little while now. I'm currently in Dubai, so it's around 10:30 here at night. So I've been in Dubai for the last 3 years. We have some pretty hot summers here in Dubai for 3 to 4 months a year. A lot of the time is spent indoors, and I thought I'd just illustrate that fact with a picture that I took from the car during the summer this year. So got up to about 50 degrees here. So I have a mate over here who said that his record for kind of highest temperature was, close to 60 degrees. So yeah, it does get pretty hot here, but for 3 to 4 months of the year. But we just finished summer now, approaching sort of the autumn and the winter season when the weather is a bit better. As for me, I'm originally from Australia, so I've worked in Australia in cyber all my life prior to coming to Dubai. So I thought just, kind of first things to kick off, kind of why am I giving this talk? So in terms of myself, I'd been in security for a while, but I hadn't come from a kind of environment where, the organization was completely in the public cloud. So the last kind of 3 or 4 years have been a little bit of a learning experience for me. Learning how security works in Microsoft Azure, how all the kind of different areas fit together, as well as, what kind of things can we enable to improve the security posture of the environment over time. So I know this presentation will be pretty heavy focused towards Azure because that's where the environment for my company is based. But I hope that you can maybe pick out one or two things that you can bring into your organization and that may be useful. So I've been a long-term kind of attendee of different SANS summits over the years, and I think it's really great to have this kind of environment where you can take technical things and hear from great speakers. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity for myself to give a talk this time. So, I mean, one thing to note with security and the different features in Microsoft is that, there's different levels of licensing in Microsoft. So, your mileage may vary in terms of the material that I kind of cover here. But hopefully there's a few things, as I said, that you can pick up and that you find useful in this presentation. So I thought the first thing to kind of start off with, being talking about security in the public cloud and also in the Microsoft world, is to talk about zero trust. And I think everyone who's been involved in public cloud or with security has heard this buzz term. I think it is kind of important just to go back and have a look, why it's important and why it's there as a design principle when building out security, not only in Microsoft Azure, but any kind of public cloud provider, the AWS, the GCPs. It is an important concept to kind of consider in terms of implementation and how do we, look at things from zero trust perspective. So I took this graphic from Microsoft. There's three main areas here. The first thing is to verify explicitly. And what we're talking about there is when we're looking at where the authentication is coming from, we need to make sure that it satisfies all the requirements that we have set up as an organization. So it could be things like, where the user is coming from, are they coming from a managed device, are they authorized to access this resource? So it's important that we define those rules explicitly. We make sure that by the time that a user gets access to something, they've passed all the authentication or the authorization rules, and they're allowed to access what they are trying to access. Second thing is to use least privileged access. So when we talk about IAM and cloud entitlements, it is a pretty complex subject. In the world of Microsoft and in Azure, we use roles. And then as part of those roles, we have individual entitlements, which allow access to a resource or allow you as a user to do certain things. So, In terms of access in general, it's always good practice to look at least privilege access. And what that also means down the track is that if an account gets compromised, we've tried to narrow down the access that that account has at the beginning, and to lower kind of the blast radius or the scope of what that user is able to do down the track. And the last piece is assume breach. How I like to look at this is that before something like this happens, we should prepare well. And from the Microsoft and the Azure world, that means things like getting all your logs into your SIEM, understanding what those logs are, whether it be authentication logs, audit logs, alerts from security control. We understand what those are, what they entail, and how to interpret them. But it also means things like having instant response plan in place, having playbooks in place, as well as understanding what to do in terms of remediation if something would happen. So if a user account got compromised, what actions would I take to remediate that? So things right through from resetting a user's password to revoking session tokens, to disabling the account, to isolating the device that the user has been assigned. So all of those things are kind of important, to document, to understand how it works, so that when something happens, we can respond efficiently and fast to minimize the impact of any security incident or breach. So the next thing that I want to talk about was the importance of securing the identity for security monitoring. So I guess during my journey in cloud security, when you think about traditional kind of environments of having your devices, your appliances inside a data center, and then moving to the environment where everything is in the public cloud, especially over the last, kind of 3 or 4 years, where users have been able to work from home more, maybe, and then be able to, access the company network resources from outside of the traditional office environment. And when we think about those kind of scenarios, we kind of look at the traditional network security sort of dissolving and disappearing. And then we kind of focus more on where is that access coming from? And that's when we kind of look at the identity piece. So the way I like to look at this is that, in the public cloud, identity is important. And as part of securing the identity, it is really good practice to put MFA on everything. So in terms of all your identities. And I guess the caveat here is that we're putting MFA on everything. There will potentially always be the situation where you have identities for one reason or another, and for the most part, maybe legitimate, where they may not be able to use MFA, and there may be single-factor authentication. So I guess in terms of detection and response and security monitoring, it is important to know about those exceptions, to have it documented, to have it monitored as part of your security monitoring use cases, know how to respond if you see unusual activity around those exceptions. So that's definitely one area that I would preach to look at when you think about securing the identity. And then the last thing is kind of knowing who your privileged identities are, where your break glass accounts sit, and when we think about securing the identity in Microsoft Azure, we may think of things like the global administrator accounts, break glass accounts, accounts that have privileged roles that are attached, which allow a user to elevate their privileges to something else to be able to carry out a privileged activity. So that's what this one is about. The next slide was to talk about conditional access. So before I kind of started my public cloud journey in Azure, I didn't know what this was. I'd never heard of it. And the way I kind of like to look at this is think of, the analogy of someone trying to access something that you value. So I guess the thing for me would be someone who, wants to come into your house. And when you think about it in how that kind of example would relate to conditional access, you may have, reasons or criteria that you put in place before allowing that person to access your house. So maybe things like, who are they? how do you verify that that person is who they say they are? What kind of car they arrive in? Whether the time that they try and access your house, is normal, or whether it's something abnormal if they're trying to cover midnight. So when you think of what conditional access is, it's something similar in the Microsoft Entra, or the Active Directory environment. So conditional access is a way that you as the administrator or you as the organization can define a set of if-else rules that determine whether a user and then also maybe the device that they're coming in from are allowed to access your corporate network, or whether they don't pass the criteria that you set, and then they're denied access to the corporate network. So in the middle of that is the policy decision engine, which in conditional access, is a series of if-else statements. And we're looking at similar things like maybe user group membership, the geographical location that the person's trying to sign in from, whether they're coming from a managed device or not. So whether it's a personal device that they're trying to sign in from, or whether it's a managed device, applications that are part of your conditional access, and then also the whole Microsoft Entra side around the security detection piece. So one thing that Microsoft Entra does a lot of is it looks at security analytics around where the authentication is coming from, and then it calculates the risks based upon what it sees and what it previously knows about your normal signing activity. So this can all be incorporated into decisions which basically allow you to specify whether that person or identity can get access to your company resource. So I just listed a few important things to kind of consider as well when you're implementing conditional access or thinking about implementing it. So definitely one important thing, which also comes back to the previous slide, is that when you're going through setting up conditional access, you may have legitimate reasons and purposes that you have a user, or maybe it's a group that is excluded from conditional access policies. And this is something that's important to monitor from a security monitoring perspective. So, whether addition goes to that group, or whether a removal of someone from that group, they're kind of important things to monitor. Again, it comes back to looking at how you handle exceptions, to your policy, and also to maybe MFA and those things like that. Definitely it's something that you want to know about, and more sometimes it also be maybe indication that someone does have access in your environment, and then they're trying to establish persistence by manipulating the policies that you set up to stop those kind of things. So I guess a follow-on from that slide around conditional access is when you think about identity with Microsoft Entra, and then all of the different third-party and SaaS applications that your organization may use, then you kind of approach the discussion around, how do I, from an identity management point of view, what ways could I look at to simplify that access? And then, the predominant way that we kind of look at is how can we enable integration of that application with Microsoft Entra? And what that means is that we incorporate authentication together from that third-party application to our IDP being Entra. And there's kind of a whole bunch of advantages to doing this. One is that once you integrate authentication with your applications with SSO, they also then become subject to your conditional access policies, which means that you can then control authentication to come from, say, a managed corporate device. You can maybe block access from certain geographical locations. And then all the access that comes through is now subject to all of those security policies that you've put into Microsoft Entra. So things like enforcing multi-factor authentication, having Microsoft Entra monitor the security analytics side around where the authentication to that application is coming from. You have a single source for authentication logs in terms of Azure sign-in logs. They're all in the same place. And I think the other thing is that you have control of the more control over the user identity lifecycle when you think of users moving from one role to another or leaving the organization. If this access, to your directory and to your application is from the one place and linked to the same identity, then it becomes much easier to manage as well from that perspective. So the next part is around looking at the different kind of risk-based and security analytics in Microsoft Entra. So there are a few different examples of how Microsoft analyzed the security side. But what I put into this slide were kind of three areas that they do it in. So one is in terms of risky sign-ins. That's Microsoft's way to look at where users are signing in from. And then to determine, look at different factors to determine whether it's risky or not. The second thing is to look and baseline where users are signing in from to see if they're coming from a location that isn't the same as where they would normally sign in from. So this may be things like when users, if they're predominantly working from the one location, they then go on holidays, they bring their managed computer to that location, and then they do a sign in. Then this may trigger this kind of alert from Microsoft. And then the last one is around something called Smart Lockout. So one thing that I've noticed with looking at the sign-in logs over time is that Microsoft will, if you're using Entra, over time they will release new kind of detections to look at, ways threat actors are trying to steal users' identities, maybe try and do password spray or do those kind of attacks. So this is one thing that I noticed from looking at the sign-in logs during one time. I noticed that there was a new event when I looked up that event code, which was 500053. It correlated to something called Smart Lockout. And then when I read about it on the Microsoft website, it's when a threat actor tries to do a password stray or maybe brute force your user. And then Microsoft is smart enough to recognize, based upon the factors of maybe where it's coming from, the user agent, those kind of things, it's smart enough to realize that this is not the legitimate or actual user that's trying to sign in. It's actually a bad actor. So what it would do is that it will then lock out that bad actor automatically, but still allow the legitimate user to be able to sign in. And you'll see this come up in your Azure sign-in log. So this can be a useful kind of area to get threat intelligence around threat actors, trying to target your users, and also trying to understand, potentially maybe a user account that in your organization has been compromised as well. So the next thing that I wanted to kind of look at was different scenarios in terms of identity that is good to be monitored and be prepared to respond to. So the things like MFA bombing and fraud attempts that your users may notice. So when you're looking at multi-factor authentication in Microsoft, you have things such as the Microsoft Authenticator app. And, those are areas where a threat actor may try and exploit to be able to steal your user's identity. So I guess for this piece, it's important to educate your users around, how their identity works in Entra, if this is the IDP that your organization is using. And then also look at ways that they can report abuse as well. So one example is, multi-factor authentication fraud alert. That's a way that a user can report when they suspect that maybe there's some fraudulent activity happening on their MFA. And, those kind of notifications will show up in your logs, as well as show up in emails to administrators. And that's where you can kind of come in and have a look at it. And the other last thing is around self-service password reset. So this is something that may come up in the Azure AD logs. And again, it's one thing to kind of look at and to be aware of. There's different ways, your organization may look at to kind of enable the self-service password side. But it's also important to look at how that can be abused as well. So hunting detection opportunities. So I guess during my time in looking at Azure sign-in logs, audit logs, and those kind of things, I wanted to highlight some areas, which may be, good to kind of look at from a detection point of view, but from a hunt point of view as well. So the first thing is Microsoft Graph API, which is sort of a programmatic way for an authorized user to be able to access your organization's M365 data. And up until quite recently, the visibility into this Graph API was quite limited. So you could look in the Azure sign-in logs as shown in this slide to see which app is being signed into. It would come up as the Graph Explorer. You could also look in the Azure AD audit logs to see what change was done and have a look at the user agent to see whether it was coming from the Graph API. But recently, Microsoft have released public preview for the Graph Explorer or the Graph audit logs, which is a great thing. So I think it's in public preview now. And then you'll be able to turn on auditing for usage of the Graph API. So seeing when, people use this method to retrieve information about your M365 data, or when an unauthorized threat actor uses the same way to take stuff that they shouldn't. So that's definitely something that we would be looking at, and it's something that's great that's come up from Microsoft recently. Some of the other things are around looking at CLI management access. So the example that I've given there is Azure Active Directory PowerShell, but also includes things like Azure CLI. So kind of baselining how your users are signing in and which kind of applications that they're signing in from, particularly command line interface management applications, may give you an idea of, are certain users being targeted? Is there a reason why a threat actor is trying to get in this way but not another way? And then the last thing is around privilege roles. So this comes back to, kind of the whole idea around IAM entitlements, having roles in place. What entitlements do those roles have? So, there's lots of different ways to elevate your privileges in Microsoft Entra. One way is through assignment of a privilege role, then using PIM, which is Privileged Identity Management, for a user to elevate that privilege on demand. So I guess when you think about that use case, it's also important to monitor, how those roles can be abused. And I've given a few kind of examples there around assignment of roles to a user outside of PIM or activation of a PIM role outside of normal business hours. And also things like modification of existing role to add excessive permissions. So that's something else to keep an eye on as well. The next thing that I want to look at was, kind of enterprise application consent and permissions. So when you think about what an enterprise application is, it's a way for a third party or SaaS application to be able to interact with your organization or IDP data. In that same way, it can also be abused by third-party threat actors. And there's different ways that you can kind of recognize this and look at this from a log point of view. So one way is to look at, what the workflow is, and you can set that workflow to be preventative in Entra, which is to define what's called an admin consent workflow. It's basically a way that you can set that an administrator is the only person allowed to grant consent to the application that's asking for access to your organization or your IDP. And then it becomes a way of preventing users from consenting to applications on their own. It also becomes a way for your security team to be able to review those applications which are requesting consent and also the permissions that they're requesting. I think whenever you see an application requesting a long list of permissions and things like what is in the screenshot here, it can potentially be a red flag because you should really look at, does the application really need access to read mail in my mailboxes and different kind of things, because it could mean that it's a malicious application and then it's asking for too many privileges that it should have access to. I wanted to remain sort of technology agnostic, but with the organization that I'm working for, it's completely in the Microsoft and Azure world. So, one of the things that we are using is Office 365 security. These are kind of a few, different things that kind of get the most out of that technology as an email gateway. So things like making sure you have SPF and DMARC enabled. Um, you know, Making sure that you have impersonation protection enabled for your important users, so people like your CXO suite. This is good protection against scammers trying to use CXO fraud to impersonate your C-level executives, and then ask users for things like purchasing gift cards, those kind of things. And then you have kind of the same kind of things that you'd look at for any kind of email gateway. And I guess the last piece is also looking at if you're in this kind of Microsoft world, how do you ingest those logs into your SIEM? So, and I guess those things that I'm referring to here, things like Exchange email, and then also Office 365 unified audit logs. The next part is around cloud security posture management. So, there are different kind of tools that do the same thing, depending on which public cloud provider that you're with. The one that I'm going to be looking at here primarily is Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which is Microsoft CSPM. So I guess a few important things to look at here are if you're using this to evaluate and improve your cloud security posture over time, taking a risk-based approach. So looking at the most critical recommendations first and seeing how you can tackle those initially. Use exemptions also for things that don't apply, and then to measure those improvements over time. And I guess kind of the interesting things that I've kind of taken out from the Microsoft CSPM is that they have an application control detective functionality that can be used to baseline applications that are running on your virtual machines, and then report on those things which may be executed that aren't part of your baseline. So this may be a good detective way of looking at things and understanding things that shouldn't be running on your VMs. And then the second thing is around file integrity monitoring. There's a FIM piece as well that's part of the Microsoft Defender for Cloud offering. And then also looking at things, which is, sort of housekeeping around ensuring that diagnostic logging has been enabled on various Azure infrastructure pieces that your organization may be using. So things like if a new Azure Key Vault is spun up, and if that's the way that you're keeping store, your secrets, you want to make sure that you have that audit logging enabled. And one way to kind of see that it isn't enabled is to look at how Defender for Cloud evaluates that diagnostic logging on various pieces of your Azure infrastructure. So the next thing that I want to talk about was the Microsoft Graph Security API. So this is the way, or the primary way that you'll be able to ingest different security alerts from different security controls in the Microsoft and the Azure world into your SIEM. And the benefits of that are, you have a centralized pane of glass for monitoring all that come from your Microsoft security ecosystem. And I guess the important thing that I've found to be aware of here is that, be wary of, I guess, the interval that logs from the Microsoft ecosystem are ingested into your SIEM. Some of these things you can pull in real time. Some other things, when they call the API, may be delayed for 15, 20 minutes. Some other things may potentially be delayed for a few hours. So knowing the time frame, or knowing how long it takes to ingest something, also helps with use case creation and doing security monitoring and response. So the next thing was around security incident response in Microsoft Azure. So I've kind of listed the 6 steps part of the incident response cycle, and the most important one is preparation. So you should be prepared, and it comes back to sort of the zero trust principle around assume breach. You should be prepared for something before it happens, and those are things like knowing about your Azure infrastructure, knowing where your important identities are, making sure that you have all the important log sources ingested into your SIEM. So maybe things like Azure sign-in logs, Azure audit logs, events and logs that you ingest from the Graph Security API. It could be things that are coming from log analytics workspaces that you pull into your SIEM. So making sure that all the bits and pieces are pulled into your SIEM, you know where to look. You have monitoring, security monitoring use cases defined. You have runbooks and an IR plan defined. So having all of that stuff done before something happens, is a very important thing. And there are, resources that are available from Microsoft as well to help with that journey. So this is the last slide. So it's talking about, I guess, proactive defense in Azure. And I think with any kind of public cloud environment, whether it's Microsoft Azure, AWS or GCP, it's still an unknown. And I guess what I mean when I say that is that, there are TTPs that exist out there that, we aren't aware of that could be used to perform an attack. That could be used by a threat actor if they had access internally within your public cloud environment to move laterally. It could mean that there's cloud entitlements that maybe haven't been documented very well or that we don't know about that are abused to do something. And this kind of area is really looking at, what are the kind of things that we could do to proactively defend against this if we don't know about it. So, I thought about three things. One thing was that, there are open source tools like Azure Hound, Azure AD Recon, other things that, we could download and then get at authorization to run within the environment to work out, are there attack paths that we're not aware of? Are there ways to pivot from one identity to another identity to get to a privileged location in the public cloud, things like that. The second thing was, and something that we do quite a bit of, which is to speak to your Microsoft account manager about what kind of on-demand security assessments that can be run as part of the support agreement that you may have. So this is always useful to understand, I guess, from a baseline perspective, have I enabled everything that can be enabled to improve the security posture? Are there maybe things that are missing? Are there exceptions or accounts that have been overprivileged, have more access than they should have? And then the last thing is, to use things like threat intelligence to understand what kind of new TTPs may come up over time, what kind of new areas of attack that have been documented by security researchers. And, cloud entitlements are complex. There are areas that we don't know about yet, and it's important to, understand and look at how we can, lock that down. And that comes back to least privilege, understanding where your privileged identities are, make sure you have monitoring over privileged roles, privileged identities, and know how to respond to that. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks for listening.